In a small town that worshipped every Sunday, a man of God would one day cast out his own daughter while she was in labor, and years later, the same daughter would hold the power to decide whether he lived or died. Pastor Elijah Williams built his fame and his pride on condemning sin. Every Sunday, his deep voice thundered through the walls of New Hope Church as he declared that those who conceived children before marriage were shameful and deserving of punishment, not mercy. The congregation adored him for his certainty, and the more they admired him, the more he mistook fear for faith. Behind the pulpit, Elijah was not a saint, but a man terrified of whispers. He feared the eyes of his neighbors more than the eyes of God, and every decision he made was chained to the need for approval. When his wife died, he swore to raise their only daughter Sarah as proof of his holiness, a spotless example of obedience and purity that could silence gossip and glorify his sermons. Sarah lived according to his script. Each dawn she brewed his coffee, pressed his shirt, and walked to nursing school with quiet discipline. She never stayed out late, never questioned his teachings, and never imagined that perfection could become a prison. To everyone on Oak Street, she was the pastor's angel, the living portrait of virtue, the girl who smiled even when her heart felt heavy. Elijah's pride grew with every compliment he heard. He loved that people called him a righteous father, a man who had done God's work at home as well as in the church. But what he did not know was that the same pride that kept his name clean would soon stain everything he loved. Because beneath that perfect house, beneath Sarah's gentle silence, destiny was waiting, and one night, it would knock on his door wearing the face of judgment. Sarah Williams was 20 years old, a gentle girl with soft brown eyes and hands that trembled only when she prayed. She lived with her father in a small, spotless house on Oak Street, where even the curtains looked disciplined. Each morning before sunrise, she brewed coffee, folded the newspaper neatly beside his chair, and whispered, "Good morning, Papa," as though reverence itself could keep their fragile peace alive. She studied at the city's nursing school, dreaming of helping sick children and making her late mother proud. Her life moved in perfect rhythm, classes by day, church by night, studying until the lamp burned low. To anyone watching, she was the model daughter of a holy man. But inside, she lived in quiet fear, fear of disappointing her father, fear of stepping out of the narrow path he built for her, fear that love in their home was something she had to earn every single day. When her classmates invited her for late study sessions or movies, she always smiled shyly and said, "Papa's waiting." At church, she sat in the front row, notebook on her lap, eyes fixed on him as he preached about love, redemption, and purity. His voice filled the room like thunder, and his words so certain, so unforgiving, often made her chest tighten. When he spoke of sinners, of women who lost their virtue, she could feel the unspoken expectation pressing against her ribs. Never be one of them. The congregation saw perfection, Sarah saw pressure. And somewhere deep down, she began to wonder if her father's God truly loved those who failed, or only those who obeyed. Pastor Elijah, proud of his flawless daughter, would often say to neighbors, "Sarah is my blessing. She walks the righteous path as her mother once did." The townspeople smiled and nodded, whispering how lucky he was to have a child so devoted. He believed it too, letting the admiration feed the one sin he never confessed, his pride. Every praise became a mirror reflecting what he most wanted to see: a holy man, a pure family, a life untouched by scandal. But in the stillness of night, when the church bells stopped echoing and the house grew silent, Sarah sometimes stood at her window, staring at the dim lights of the city. She wondered what it felt like to live without fear, to make her own choices, to be loved, not for perfection, but for simply being herself. The thought frightened her, and yet it also felt like freedom. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices she could almost understand, voices that seemed to warn her that peace built on silence never lasts. And as she closed her window and prayed herself to sleep, she did not know that just a few streets away, something or someone was already moving toward her, carrying the darkness that would shatter her perfect world forever. Pastor Elijah Williams had always believed that holiness could be measured by how others spoke his name. In the small town of New Hope, reputation was the same as righteousness, and no man guarded his image more fiercely than he did. Every morning, he polished his shoes until they shone, pressed his collar until it stood sharp against his neck, and walked through the streets as if each step were a sermon. People would greet him with admiration. "Good morning, Pastor," and he would nod with the solemn grace of a man convinced God himself was watching. But it was not God's judgment that haunted him, it was the whispers of men. Behind closed doors, Elijah was less a father and more a warden of faith. He kept the house silent and spotless, as though dust itself was a sign of weakness. Sarah learned to move quietly, to speak softly, and to smile even when she felt small. His approval was a currency she earned through obedience. And each time she saw him smile from the pulpit, she told herself it was worth it, that this was love, even if it felt like fear. At New Hope Church, his sermons had become legendary. People said he could make a sinner tremble just by raising his voice. "God's laws are not suggestions," he would declare, eyes blazing under the golden light that filtered through the stained glass windows. "To disobey is to invite ruin, and those who stray will face the fire." The congregation hung on his every word, some in awe, others in fear. Mothers would whisper to their daughters, "Be like Sarah, pure and obedient." And Elijah would hear it, satisfied that his family's perfection had become the living proof of his success. But pride is a silent poison, and Elijah was already drinking deeply. He didn't notice how his compassion faded, replaced by performance. He didn't notice that while his sermons spoke of forgiveness, his heart had grown incapable of it. Late at night, he would stare at his reflection in the mirror, tracing the deep lines on his face. "I have done everything right," he would whisper. "God must see that." Yet in the hollow of his eyes, something restless lingered, a shadow that even prayer couldn't chase away. Meanwhile, the town around him whispered different prayers. Some envied his discipline, others pitied Sarah. They saw how she followed him like a ghost, always polite, always smiling, but never laughing. "A perfect daughter," they said, but perfect things break the easiest. One Thursday evening, as the last of the church candles flickered out, Elijah stood alone by the altar, clutching his Bible. The stained glass threw red light across his face like blood. He thought about the next Sunday's sermon, about sin, about purity, about women who invite temptation. He did not know that before he preached those words again, temptation would come for him not in lust, but in pride, in judgment, and in the cruel test of love disguised as disgrace. Somewhere outside, footsteps echoed in the dark alley behind the church, faint but growing closer, a sound that would soon connect two fates forever. It was a Thursday evening in October, the air heavy with the scent of falling rain and burnt leaves. The campus library glowed softly against the darkening sky as Sarah packed her nursing textbooks into her worn brown bag. She had stayed late, studying neonatal care, how to help newborn babies breathe, how to hold life gently in trembling hands. Her classmates laughed and waved goodbye, their voices echoing down the hall. "Don't stay too late, Sarah," one called. She smiled faintly and replied, "Papa worries if I'm late for dinner." The streets were quiet as she walked home. Storefronts closed one by one, lights dimming until only the yellow haze of the street lamps remained. Sarah's shoes clicked softly on the pavement, the rhythm steady, comforting. She turned onto Main Street, her usual path toward Oak Street, where her father's small house waited like a silent sentry. She thought of him sitting by the window, Bible in hand, expecting the sound of her key at the door. That image, his steady figure, his voice reciting verses, made her walk faster. But as she passed a narrow alley between two old buildings, she heard a sound that froze her breath, a scrape of boots against gravel, then a low voice, slurred and rough. From the darkness, a man stepped forward. He was tall, unshaven, and smelled of alcohol. His jacket hung crooked, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Evening, sweetheart," he said, his tone mocking. Sarah stopped, heart hammering. "Please, sir, I just want to go home." He moved closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "You're too pretty to walk alone." She took a step back, clutching her bag. "I said let me go," but he reached out, fingers like iron, seizing her arm. The world seemed to tilt as he dragged her into the alley, the streetlight vanishing behind her. She tried to scream, but his hand covered her mouth. The cold bricks pressed against her back, the smell of alcohol thick in her nose, the sound of her heartbeat roaring in her ears. Time broke apart. There were moments she would never remember, and others she would never forget. The scrape of concrete, the sting of tears, the shattering of everything she had believed about safety and faith. When it was over, she sat on the cold ground, trembling. The man disappeared into the night without a word, leaving only the echo of his boots fading into the distance. Sarah gathered her books with shaking hands. Her favorite dress was torn, her palms scraped, her breath shallow. She walked home as though underwater, every step slow and heavy. Inside her head, a single thought repeated like a prayer she could not stop. I did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. When she reached her house, the lights were still on. She crept inside, her heart pounding. From the kitchen, her father's voice called, "Sarah, dinner's ready." Her throat tightened. "I'm not hungry, Papa," she managed, forcing her voice steady. "I have to study." She locked herself in her room, pressed her back against the door, and slid to the floor. In the dim light, she saw her reflection in the mirror, hair tangled, eyes red, a stranger staring back. She went to the bathroom and washed her hands again and again until her skin turned raw, whispering, "I'm clean, I'm clean." But no amount of water could wash away the shame that was never hers to carry. Outside, the wind howled down Oak Street, rattling the windows like a warning that everything she knew was about to change. Sarah sat awake until dawn, clutching her pillow, trying not to cry. The clock ticked like a heartbeat beside her bed, marking the seconds between the world she once knew and the one she would now have to survive. And just before the sun rose, a sharp pain gripped her chest, not from the attack, but from a thought that terrified her more than anything else. If Papa ever finds out, he'll never believe me. The weeks after that night blurred together like a fevered dream. Sarah woke each morning, went through the motions of life, and prayed no one would notice how hollow she had become. She still brewed her father's coffee, still ironed his shirts, still smiled when he asked about school. But behind that smile was silence, a silence so heavy it seemed to hum in the walls of their house. Every time she passed a mirror, she turned her face away. Every time her father preached about sin, she felt his words carve into her skin. Then the sickness began. First, it was the nausea that came before sunrise, then the faint spells, then the weight of dread that grew inside her like something alive. She had studied medicine long enough to recognize the symptoms, but she clung to denial like it was oxygen. "It cannot be," she whispered, counting days, whispering prayers. But her body kept answering with the truth she didn't want to hear. One night, she pressed her hand against her stomach and felt the smallest flutter life, innocent and undeserved. And in that moment, her fear turned into horror. Sarah sat on her bed, the Bible open in her lap, eyes unfocused. "God," she whispered, "I didn't choose this. Please don't let him find out." Outside, the wind rustled the oak leaves. Inside, her heart broke with each breath. She began to wear loose clothes, long sweaters that hung past her knees. She skipped breakfast, claiming she needed to study early. She avoided his eyes, afraid that one look would expose her secret. But fathers notice what silence hides. "Sarah, you've been tired lately," Pastor Elijah said one Sunday morning as they left church. His voice was casual, but his gaze was sharp. "Are you getting enough rest?" Sarah forced a smile. "Yes, Papa. Just studying hard." He nodded, half believing, half doubting. Yet as months passed, he began to see what he could no longer ignore. Her steps grew slower, her cheeks rounder, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach. And one morning, when she thought he was still asleep, he saw her standing by the window, sunlight tracing the curve beneath her dress. The truth struck him like thunder. That night, his sermons echoed in his mind, his own words about purity, morality, and the punishment of sin. But now those words were a curse turned inward. "No," he whispered to himself, pacing the floor. "Not my daughter." He wanted to pray, but all he felt was rage. Rage at her, rage at the shame that would follow, rage at God for testing him. He thought of the people at church, of the whispers, the pity, the judgment, a pastor who cannot control his own child. The thought clawed at him until sleep would no longer come. Inside her room, Sarah knelt on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Papa, I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered to the night, though he couldn't hear her. "Please don't hate me." She knew the day was coming when truth would no longer fit behind fabric or silence. And when that day arrived, she feared her father would choose the pulpit over her, his pride over her pain. One Sunday, as church bells rang across New Hope, Sarah looked in the mirror and realized she could not hide it any longer. Her reflection showed not a sinner, but a girl caught between survival and shame. She placed her trembling hand over her heart and whispered, "I have to tell him." Outside, the sky darkened early, clouds gathering low over Oak Street, as though the heavens themselves were bracing for what was about to come. The house on Oak Street was silent that Sunday afternoon, heavy with the stillness that comes before a storm. Pastor Elijah sat by the window polishing his glasses, the Bible open beside him. He had just returned from church, where he delivered a sermon on righteousness that had left the congregation trembling in awe. But now, as he glanced toward the hallway, he could feel unease twisting in his chest, a whisper of suspicion he could no longer silence. Sarah had been quiet for weeks, avoiding his eyes, her voice smaller, her steps slower. Every instinct told him something was wrong. When the bathroom door creaked open, he looked up. Sarah stood there in her pale blue dress, her hands clasped before her, eyes red as if she'd been crying. The air between them froze. His gaze dropped from her face to the gentle curve beneath the fabric, and in that instant, time seemed to stop. The truth landed like a blade in his heart. His voice came out low, almost trembling. "Sarah, come to the living room. We need to talk." They sat opposite each other on the old couch where she had once done her homework while he prepared his sermons. Now the air was thick and cold, carrying the weight of judgment. "Are you?" he began, unable to finish the question. Sarah's lips quivered as she nodded. "Yes, Papa, I'm going to have a baby." For a long moment, neither of them breathed. Then he rose abruptly, turning his back to her, gripping the windowsill as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. Outside, a few church members walked by, laughing as they headed home from service. He could already imagine their whispers. "The pastor's daughter, pregnant. Who is the father?" His words were barely audible, more command than question. Sarah stared at the floor, tears spilling silently. She wanted to tell him the truth, that there had been no choice, no consent, only terror in a dark alley, but the shame wrapped around her throat like a rope. I can't tell you, Papa," she whispered. The moment she said it, the last thread of his restraint snapped. "You can't tell me?" His voice rose, trembling with fury. "Do you understand what this means? What people will say about me, about our family? I have preached purity my entire life, and now this?" His face flushed red, his hands shook. "You've brought disgrace into this house." Sarah sobbed. "Papa, please. I never wanted this. I'm still your daughter." But he was no longer listening. In his mind, he heard not her voice, but the echo of his own sermons, his warnings against temptation, his proud declarations of moral strength. Those words had built his identity, and now his own daughter was tearing them down. "My daughter," he spat, "would never have done this." He turned from her, breathing heavily. His reflection in the window glared back a preacher's face twisted with anger, a man who had mistaken pride for faith. For a moment, he saw what he had become, not a shepherd, but a judge without mercy. Then the image flickered away, replaced by the stubborn certainty that he was right. "You have brought shame to this house," he said, voice cold as stone. "Papa, I need you," Sarah cried, reaching out a trembling hand. "Please, don't send me away." He didn't look at her. "God punishes sin, Sarah, and so must I." He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, each one heavier than the last. The front door closed behind him with a hollow thud, leaving Sarah alone in the dim light. She fell to her knees, tears soaking the carpet. For the first time in her life, she realized that love and faith did not always live in the same house. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the windows. Somewhere deep in the distance, rain began to fall soft at first, then harder, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what had just been lost. And as Sarah pressed her hands against her stomach, whispering to the child growing inside her, she did not yet know that the next storm to come would not come from the sky, but from within her own home. The storm that had gathered above Oak Street finally broke 2 months later on a cold Tuesday night in February. The air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that burned the skin. Inside the house, the lights were dim. Sarah sat in her room surrounded by her old nursing notes, pretending to study but unable to focus. Her belly was heavy now, her body aching from exhaustion. Every few minutes a dull pain rippled through her back, but she told herself it was nothing, just fatigue, just nerves. She tried to distract herself by reading about childbirth, remembering what her professors had once said about contractions, breathing, and the stages of labor. But when the next wave hit, stronger than before, she gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. It's too soon." She pressed a trembling hand to her belly. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. As the minutes passed, the pain returned, closer each time, deeper, demanding. Sweat gathered on her forehead. She stood and paced the small room, praying the movement might calm her body, but the contractions only grew more violent. Panic began to take hold. She knew what was happening. Her training made it impossible to deny. The baby was coming. Sarah staggered into the hallway, her breath short and uneven. She stopped in front of her father's door and knocked softly. "Papa," she called, voice barely above a whisper. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. "Papa, please. Something's happening. I need help." The bed creaked. Footsteps approached. The door opened, revealing Pastor Elijah, his face lined with sleep and irritation. "What is it?" he asked flatly. Sarah clutched the doorframe, her whole body trembling. "Papa, I think the baby's coming. Please, I need to go to the hospital." For a heartbeat, their eyes met hers full of fear, his full of judgment. He looked at her belly, her pale face, the sweat on her skin. A father's heart should have broken at the sight, but his remained cold. "This is your burden," he said quietly. "You made your choice. Now live with it." "Papa, please!" she cried out, her voice cracking with pain. "I'm your daughter." He turned away. "My daughter would never have done this." The words sliced through her like glass. Another contraction hit, forcing her to her knees. Tears blurred her vision as she gasped for air. "Please, don't let me do this alone." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a memory, perhaps, of the little girl who once clung to his hand during Sunday service. But pride extinguished it as quickly as it came. "You should have thought of that before you brought shame into this home," he said, and closed the door. The sound of the latch echoed like thunder in the hallway. Sarah pressed her forehead to the cold floor, shaking with sobs. The pain came again, stronger, unforgiving. She forced herself to stand, gripping the wall for balance. She couldn't stay here. She needed help. In her room, she grabbed the small bag she had packed weeks ago just in case. A coat, a blanket, the little money she had left from her part-time job. Each step down the stairs was agony. The air outside hit her like ice when she opened the door. She wrapped the coat tighter around her swollen body and stepped into the night. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes landing on her hair and lashes. The street was empty. The lights of the hospital were 6 blocks away, but each step felt impossible. Halfway down the street, another contraction struck, so fierce it drove her to her knees. She cried out, her voice barely carrying in the wind. "Help me, please." No one answered. The neighborhood slept, windows dark and silent. Sarah tried to crawl to her feet, but the pain returned in waves, relentless. Her bag spilled onto the ground, baby clothes she had sewn herself scattering into the snow. She gathered them with trembling fingers, whispering, "Please, not here. Not like this." The wind howled down Oak Street as Sarah fell forward again, clutching her belly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck midnight, and as she lay there on the frozen pavement, her body shaking, she thought of her father warm in his bed just a few feet away and realized the truth she had refused to believe. She was utterly alone. But fate was not finished with her yet. Because somewhere beyond the corner, a light flickered on in a small house, and footsteps began to move toward her. The footsteps came quickly, steady and purposeful, cutting through the howling wind. Sarah lifted her head weakly, vision blurred by tears. A figure approached, a woman wrapped in a thick coat, carrying a paper bag that swung lightly at her side. When the woman reached the sidewalk and saw Sarah collapsed on the ground, her grocery bag fell from her hands. "Oh, dear Lord," she gasped. "Child, are you all right?" Sarah tried to speak, but her voice broke apart between sobs and pain. "Please, help me. My baby. It's coming." The woman knelt beside her without hesitation, the cold pavement biting through her knees. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said, her voice calm and steady. "My name is Janet. We're going to get you somewhere warm, you hear me?" She looked around. The street was empty, silent but for the wind. The hospital was too far. Her own home was just 2 blocks away. She made her choice in an instant. Janet helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight as another contraction tore through her body. "Lean on me," Janet said firmly. "You can do this, one step at a time." Sarah clung to her, her breath shallow, her face pale as wax. They walked slowly through the snow, stopping every few feet as the pain surged again. Janet whispered encouragement, her voice like a steady fire in the freezing dark. "That's it, honey. Breathe. You're stronger than you think." By the time they reached Janet's small house, Sarah could barely stand. The porch light glowed softly, casting golden warmth against the falling snow. Janet fumbled for her keys, then guided Sarah inside. The blast of heat from the old radiator felt like a miracle. "Sit down here, love," Janet said, easing her onto the couch. "I'll get some towels and call my neighbor Ruth. She's a retired nurse." Sarah nodded weakly, clutching her belly. She had read about labor, studied it even, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The raw power, the helpless surrender of her body. When Janet returned with blankets and clean towels, she knelt beside her again, brushing the damp hair from her forehead. "You're doing so good, sweetheart. Ruth will be here any minute." Minutes later, a knock sounded at the door. Janet opened it to reveal a woman in her 60s, hair silver, eyes sharp and kind. "Janet called me," she said, setting down a leather bag. "I'm Ruth. Let's see what we've got here." Her hands were gentle, confident. "The contractions are strong and close together. This baby's not waiting for any hospital." Sarah gripped the armrest as another wave hit. Ruth moved quickly, spreading towels, giving quiet instructions. "When the pain comes, breathe slow. Don't fight it. Let your body do the work." Janet squeezed Sarah's hand and whispered prayers under her breath. Through the pain, Sarah looked around the warm little living room, the faded floral curtains, the family photographs on the wall, the smell of lavender soap. These women didn't know her name an hour ago, yet they held her like family. "Why are you helping me?" she managed to whisper. Janet's eyes glistened. "Because, honey, that's what people are supposed to do. That's what love looks like." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, not just from pain, but from something deeper: relief, disbelief, grace. For the first time since that terrible night, someone looked at her without judgment. The contractions came faster now, one on top of the next. Ruth's calm voice guided her through every breath. "That's it. You're close, sweetheart. You're so close." Sarah screamed as the next wave tore through her, gripping Janet's hand so tightly it turned white. "Good girl," Ruth said softly. "Push when your body tells you. Don't hold back." The room filled with the sound of Sarah's sobs, the storm outside pounding against the windows, and then a cry, a single, piercing, beautiful cry. Ruth smiled through tears. "It's a girl," she said, holding up a tiny, squirming bundle. "She's strong." Janet covered her mouth, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." Ruth wrapped the baby in a towel and laid her gently on Sarah's chest. Sarah's breath hitched as she stared down at the tiny face, the small hands, the dark eyes blinking up at her. "Hello, little one," she whispered through tears. "I'm your mama," the baby cooed softly, pressing her cheek against Sarah's heart. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she thought she'd lost forever: peace. Outside, the storm began to fade, the wind quieting to a whisper. But inside that little house, something far greater had begun. Sarah looked up at the 2 women who had saved her and said, "Her name is Mary." Ruth smiled. "Mary," she repeated softly. A strong name for a strong girl. Janet tucked a blanket around them both, tears still shining in her eyes. "You did it, sweetheart. She's perfect." Sarah closed her eyes, holding her baby close. For the first time in her life, she understood what real love looked like, not the kind that judges, but the kind that stays. Yet even in that moment of peace, a shadow lingered in her heart. Because just a few blocks away, her father was waking from his sleep, realizing his daughter's room was empty, and that the night he had chosen pride over love would soon return to haunt him. The morning came slowly, carrying the soft light of dawn through the lace curtains of Janet's living room. The storm had passed, leaving the streets blanketed in snow, pure and silent, as if the world itself had been washed clean. Sarah lay on the couch, pale but peaceful, her newborn daughter pressed against her chest. The baby's breath rose and fell in perfect rhythm with hers, a fragile melody of life. Janet moved quietly through the room, bringing a cup of warm tea and a plate of toast. "You need to eat, sweetheart," she said softly. "Your body's been through a battle." Sarah tried to sit up, but Ruth gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Easy now. You rest. You've done beautifully." Ruth had stayed through the night, watching over mother and child, ensuring both were safe. Her years as a nurse had taught her that sometimes the best medicine wasn't in bottles, it was in the touch of kindness and the sound of reassurance. Sarah sipped her tea slowly, her eyes never leaving the tiny face nestled against her. "She's so small," she whispered. Janet smiled. "Small but fierce. She made it through a storm, didn't she? So did you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "I didn't think I'd survive last night." Janet sat beside her and brushed a lock of hair from her forehead. "You did more than survive, Sarah. You brought life into this world with nothing but courage and faith." The baby stirred, making soft noises. Sarah traced her daughter's cheek with her fingertip, marveling at how delicate she was. Her skin like silk, her fingers curling instinctively around Sarah's thumb. "Her name is Mary," she said again, as if sealing the promise with her own breath. "Mary," Janet repeated with a nod. "A name of hope," Ruth smiled faintly, "and of redemption." Sarah leaned back, exhausted but content. For the first time in months, her fear was quiet, yet behind that calm, guilt still whispered. She thought of her father, of his anger, of the cold words that had driven her out into the snow. Would he even care if I never came back? She wondered. Then, almost immediately, another thought followed a colder one. Would he care more about his reputation than about whether I lived or died? Ruth noticed the shadow crossing her face. "You're thinking of him, aren't you?" Sarah nodded faintly. "He's all I have left," she said. "But I don't think I have a place in his world anymore." Janet shook her head. "You have a place here, you and that baby both, as long as you need it." The words broke something inside her. For so long, Sarah had lived by the rules of duty and fear. But now, in the home of two strangers, she felt something sacred, a love that asked for nothing, a mercy without conditions. She closed her eyes, letting that truth settle deep inside her. "Thank you," she whispered. As the hours passed, the house filled with warmth and quiet laughter. Janet made soup while Ruth tidied up, humming a hymn under her breath. Sarah fed Mary, her heart swelling each time those tiny eyes met hers. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier, she had been alone on a frozen street praying for her child not to die. Now, surrounded by kindness, she dared to believe in miracles again. When evening came, Ruth packed up her medical bag and kissed Sarah on the forehead. "I'll check on you tomorrow," she said. "And don't you worry, your little girl's healthy and strong. You're both going to be fine." Sarah smiled faintly. "You saved us." Ruth's eyes softened. "Honey, you saved yourself. We just helped you see it." After Ruth left, Janet sat with Sarah near the fire, the baby asleep between them. The crackle of the flames filled the room, the shadows dancing on the walls. "Sarah," Janet said quietly, "you can stay here as long as you need. No one deserves to face the world alone." Sarah looked at her, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know how to repay you." Janet reached over, taking her hand. "Kindness doesn't need repayment, child. The only thing I ask is that you pass it on someday." Sarah nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. She didn't know what the future held, how she would raise Mary, where she would go, but for the first time, she didn't feel powerless. She was a mother now, and that word carried a strength she had never known she possessed. Outside, the snow began to fall again. soft and silent, covering the world in a blanket of white. But inside that little house, there was warmth, real warmth, the kind that came not from fire or blankets, but from compassion. As Sarah drifted toward sleep, she whispered one last promise to her daughter, "I'll never let you feel unloved." And somewhere in the night, miles away, Pastor Elijah woke from a restless dream, his heart pounding, his throat dry. In his mind, he saw flashes of a snowy street, the echo of a woman's cry, the sound of a baby's first breath. He sat up in bed, trembling, unsure if it was a dream or a warning. But deep inside, he felt it. The beginning of his reckoning had already begun. The days that followed felt like a dream made of sunlight and quiet tears. Sarah recovered slowly in Janet's home, her body weak but her spirit awakening in ways she could not explain. Every morning she woke to the soft sound of a baby's cry, to the smell of coffee, to the warmth of someone moving in the kitchen. It had been years since she'd felt safe enough to simply exist. Now, surrounded by love that asked for nothing, she began to breathe again. Janet seemed to know what she needed before she spoke. When Mary cried through the night, Janet appeared beside her with warm towels. When Sarah stared at the wall, lost in thoughts of the life she'd left behind, Janet would touch her shoulder gently and say, "You're not alone anymore, honey." One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the curtains, Sarah sat feeding Mary on the couch. "I don't know how I'll ever thank you," she said softly. Janet smiled. "You don't have to. Kindness isn't a debt, Sarah. It's a seed. You just plant it somewhere else when you're ready." Her words sank deep into Sarah's heart. For years, she had believed that goodness was something you had to prove, something you earned by never failing. But here, in this modest living room, she learned that grace wasn't given because you were perfect, it was given because you were human. When Mary slept, Sarah often found herself standing at the window, watching the small neighborhood beyond. Children ran through the snow, chasing each other with laughter that echoed through the street. Mothers stood on porches, waving them in for supper. Life moved on, unaware of her small miracle inside the house. Sometimes she wondered if her father had noticed she was gone. Maybe he had convinced himself she was away at school. Maybe he didn't think of her at all. The thought stung, but it no longer crushed her. Janet's house became a sanctuary, and over time, a rhythm formed. Ruth visited often, bringing donated baby clothes and small jars of homemade jam. Neighbors, hearing whispers of the young mother Mrs. Janet helped, began to drop by discreetly with casseroles, pretending it was just to say hello. No one asked questions, and for that, Sarah was grateful. People in small towns had their ways of showing compassion without words. They didn't pry, but they didn't turn away either. At night, when the fire crackled low, Sarah would look at Mary sleeping beside her and feel something close to faith, not the rigid faith her father had preached, but a living faith born from mercy and struggle. "You'll have a better life, little one," she whispered. "You'll grow up knowing that love isn't supposed to hurt." Janet, sitting nearby with her knitting, would smile quietly, as though she'd heard every word. As weeks turned into months, Sarah began to regain her strength. She helped Janet around the house, cooked meals, and even laughed again, real laughter, the kind that warmed the heart instead of hiding sorrow. Every giggle from Mary made her stronger. "You've got her spirit," Janet teased one morning. "That little one's going to change the world someday." Sarah smiled. "Then I'll make sure the world doesn't break her before she gets the chance." But even as peace settled into her days, the shadow of her father lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She hadn't written him, hadn't dared to. She didn't know if he'd even open a letter from her. Part of her wanted him to come find her, to look her in the eyes and finally see her pain. But another part knew that if he ever did, he might still choose pride over love. That fear was a wound that refused to close. One evening, Ruth came by with a bundle of blankets. "You know, Janet," she said while setting them down, "folks have been talking. They say Pastor Elijah's church is getting emptier every week." Sarah froze. "What do you mean?" Ruth sighed. "Seems people started asking questions about what happened to you. Word travels fast in small towns. Some stopped going altogether. Others said they couldn't listen to a man preach forgiveness when he couldn't forgive his own child." Sarah said nothing, her heart heavy and conflicted. She didn't want to destroy him, but she couldn't deny a part of her felt a strange justice in it. Maybe now he was beginning to understand what it felt like to lose everything. Janet put a gentle hand on her shoulder. The truth always finds its way home, honey. It might take years, but it never stays buried. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah sat awake holding Mary. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, strong despite their size. Sarah whispered, "I'll never let you feel the kind of loneliness I felt." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Pain had made her who she was, but love would decide who she became. She didn't know it yet, but across town, in a dimly lit church, Pastor Elijah was standing at his pulpit, staring out at the half-empty pews, wondering if the God he preached about had finally turned his back, or if he was trying to make him see what love truly meant. The seasons turned quietly over New Hope. Winter melted into spring, and spring into another humid summer. In that time, Sarah's life began to bloom again, slow but certain, like the first green shoots pushing through cracked soil. With Janet's help, she found small jobs babysitting for neighbors, washing linens at the local inn, even cleaning pews at the church across town where no one knew her last name. The work was hard, but it was honest, and every dollar she earned went toward building a new life for Mary. Each night, she fell asleep with her daughter's soft breathing beside her and a feeling she hadn't known in years' purpose. By September, Sarah had gathered enough courage to visit her old nursing school. The head instructor, Mrs. Davis, blinked in surprise when she saw her standing there, baby in arms, thinner but stronger than before. "Sarah Williams," she said slowly, "we thought we'd lost you." Sarah lowered her gaze. "You almost did," she replied quietly, "but I want to finish what I started." There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Davis smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Classes start next week. Let's find a way to make this work." And somehow, they did. Sarah worked mornings at a daycare run by Janet's friend, who allowed her to bring Mary along. In the afternoons, she attended lectures, staying late at the library to study while Mary napped beside her. It wasn't easy. There were nights she barely slept, mornings when she thought she couldn't go on, but she did. Each small victory felt like redemption. Meanwhile, across town, Pastor Elijah's world was slowly collapsing. The once bustling church that had echoed with hymns and hallelujahs now sat half-empty on Sundays. The donations had dwindled, leaving cracks in the walls, unpaid bills, and a silence that felt like judgment. Rumors had spread through New Hope, rumors of a daughter cast out in shame, of a pastor who preached mercy but lived without it. Some members had confronted him directly. "Pastor," one woman had said gently, "how can we believe in forgiveness when you could not forgive your own child?" Elijah had no answer. He only tightened his jaw and said, "God's ways are not ours." But when he went home to his empty house on Oak Street, those words turned to ashes in his mouth. He avoided Sarah's old room, yet some nights he would find himself standing at its door, hand hovering over the knob, afraid to open it. The silence inside felt heavier than any sermon he had ever given. Pride, once his shield, had become his punishment. At church, his sermons grew harsher, his voice weaker. The fire that once drew people in now repelled them. He prayed longer, ate less, and began to wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. He told himself it was the burden of leadership, but deep down he knew it was guilt, a guilt that had aged him faster than time itself. Back at Janet's house, life had taken on the rhythm of hope. Mary was nearly 2 now, running around the kitchen with her chubby legs and mischievous laughter. She followed Sarah everywhere, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit Ruth had given her. Janet adored her like her own grandchild, often saying, "You know, Sarah, she's got your eyes but my attitude." And they would laugh, not realizing how much that laughter meant that it was the sound of healing. Sarah excelled in her final semester. Her instructors praised her composure under pressure, her compassion with patience. "You'll make an extraordinary nurse," they told her. She didn't do it for praise or pride. She did it for Mary, for the promise she had made in the snow, the night her daughter was born. But one evening, as she walked home from the hospital after a long shift, Sarah passed by New Hope Church. The building loomed in the twilight, its paint peeling, the sign out front faded and cracked. Through the dusty windows, she saw a figure kneeling alone at the altar. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The shape of his shoulders, the slow rise and fall of his chest, it was her father. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the years had hollowed him out. She stood in the shadows, unseen, torn between the urge to walk away and the ache that told her she couldn't. But then he lifted his head, and for an instant their eyes met through the glass. His expression was unreadable shock, sorrow, disbelief. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned and walked away into the night, Mary's laughter still echoing in her memory. Behind her, Pastor Elijah pressed a trembling hand to his chest, whispering a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. God, please, let me see her again. That prayer would be answered sooner than he ever imagined, because months later, inside the very hospital where Sarah worked, their lives would cross again, but not as father and daughter. One would lie on the edge of death, and the other would hold his fate in her hands. It was a gray Sunday morning in late autumn when the end of Pastor Elijah's old life finally came for him. The congregation at New Hope had thinned to barely 30 souls, most of them gray-haired and weary. He stood at the pulpit, Bible in hand, ready to deliver his sermon about redemption, a topic he had avoided for years. The stained glass windows threw fractured light across the sanctuary, colors trembling over his face. He began to speak, but his words stumbled. The Lord forgives. His voice faltered. A sudden dizziness swept through him. His fingers gripped the pulpit to steady himself, but the world spun faster, faces in the pews blurred. A father should always, he tried to continue, but pain shot through his chest like lightning. Gasps echoed through the church as he swayed and fell. "Call an ambulance!" shouted Deacon Gabriel, running down the aisle. Panic broke across the room. By the time paramedics arrived, Elijah's breathing was shallow, his pulse thready. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, he whispered, barely conscious, "God, forgive me." The sirens wailed down Oak Street toward City General Hospital, the same hospital where Sarah had begun her first week as a full-time emergency nurse. Inside the ER, Sarah was reviewing patient charts when the radio crackled. Incoming male, approximately 60 years old, cardiac arrest, history of hypertension. It was routine, nothing unusual. She prepared the trauma bay, checking monitors and equipment. The doors burst open, and the paramedics wheeled in the patient. "Pastor Elijah Williams," one called out. The name hit her like a thunderclap. For a second, the world narrowed to a single point: the gurney, the pale face upon it, the fragile rhythm of a heart monitor beeping faintly in the background. Her father looked nothing like the man she remembered. The sharp lines of his jaw had softened, his hair now more gray than black. The authority that once filled his presence was gone, replaced by frailty and fear. "BP is 70/40 and dropping," said the paramedic. "We've given 2 doses of nitro. No response." Sarah's training took over. She pushed through the wave of emotion that threatened to drown her and moved beside the bed. "Let's start oxygen, 10 liters per minute. Set up pore access normal saline wide open." Her voice was calm, professional, practiced, but her hands trembled slightly as she attached the leads to his chest. Dr. Peterson, the attending physician, entered. "What do we have?" "Pastor Elijah Williams, age 61, Sarah replied, forcing steadiness into her tone. "Probable myocardial infarction, conscious but weak." Dr. Peterson nodded. "Let's get him stabilized." Then, noticing her expression, he asked quietly, "You know this patient?" Sarah's voice barely moved. "He's my father." Dr. Peterson's brows lifted. "Do you want to step out? I can reassign." "No," she said quickly. "I can handle it." She focused on the monitors, on the numbers, on anything but his eyes. Yet as the minutes stretched, she could feel his gaze on her, confused, disbelieving, full of something that might have been regret. Finally, when the chaos settled and the machine steadied to a slow, rhythmic beeping, Elijah's lips moved. "Sarah." His voice was a whisper, raw and broken. She looked at him briefly, her professional mask unshaken. "You need to rest. We'll move you to cardiac observation soon." "I thought I'd never see you again," he murmured, eyes glistening. She said nothing. Her silence spoke for 7 long years of abandonment and pain. You're a nurse," he said weakly, the irony hitting him with visible force. "You help people." Sarah nodded, expression unreadable. "That's what I do." When he was transferred to the cardiac unit hours later, Sarah followed protocol, updating his chart, adjusting medications, checking vitals. Every movement was precise, detached, but inside her, a storm raged. As she turned to leave his bedside, he reached out with a trembling hand. "Sarah, please," he said. "Stay, just a moment." She hesitated. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. "You once said God forgives all," she said quietly, "but you never learned to forgive the people closest to you." He swallowed hard, tears running down the side of his face. "I was wrong," he whispered. "So very wrong." She looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice measured. "You threw me out into the cold, Papa. You turned your back when I needed you most. You were supposed to protect me." Elijah's breath hitched. "I can't change what I did, but please, give me a chance to make it right." Sarah shook her head slowly. "Some things can't be undone. You taught me that yourself." She turned to go, her voice barely audible. "Rest now, Pastor. You'll need your strength." As she stepped into the hallway, her composure finally cracked. She pressed a hand against the wall, drawing deep breaths until her trembling stopped. Down the corridor, through the glass panel of his room, she could see him watching her, the proud man who had lost everything, now staring at the one person he had cast away. She walked on, her footsteps steady but her heart pounding, because deep inside she knew this was only the beginning. Their reckoning wasn't over yet. The truth he had run from for years was still waiting to be spoken, and when it finally came out, it would tear the last veil from his faith. 3 days passed before Sarah spoke to her father again. The hospital corridor outside his room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a sterile world she had learned to survive in, where emotions were replaced by protocols. But today felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, waiting. Inside, Pastor Elijah sat propped up in his bed, pale but alert, a tangle of IV lines trailing from his arm. He looked smaller than she remembered, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail, shivering man gripping his Bible like a lifeline. When Sarah entered, his eyes filled with both relief and fear. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice rasping, "I prayed you'd come." She didn't sit. "I'm here to check your vitals," she said flatly, keeping her tone professional. "After that, I'll have the doctor update your care plan." He nodded slowly, watching her every movement. "You always were so precise," he murmured. "Your mother had hands like that, too steady, gentle." Sarah froze for a heartbeat, then forced herself to continue taking his blood pressure. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't try to make this easier by remembering who we were." Pastor Elijah closed his eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said, his breath shallow. "That night, when I turned you away, I thought I was defending God's law. I thought I was saving my soul. But every year since, I've felt him grow quieter, like even heaven stopped listening to me." Sarah wrote his vitals on the chart without looking up. "I didn't come here for confession, Pastor. You have a chaplain for that." He shook his head weakly. "No, I need to tell you. You deserve to hear it from me." His voice trembled now, raw and desperate. "Throwing you out was the worst sin I ever committed. I thought shame would pass, that people would forget, but it's eaten me alive." Sarah turned toward him, eyes cold but steady. "You think guilt redeems you?" she asked. "You think admitting it after 7 years erases what you did?" Tears welled in his eyes. "Please, Sarah, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I would do anything to take it back." She stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You can't take it back. Because while you were worried about your reputation, I was out there alone, bleeding, freezing, praying someone would help me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "And someone did. Her name was Janet. A stranger. She did what you, my father, would not." Pastor Elijah's mouth trembled. You had the baby," he whispered. Sarah's eyes softened just slightly. "Her name is Mary. She's 7 years old. She loves stories about brave people and believes every sunrise is a gift." Her father's face crumpled. "A granddaughter," he choked out. "I have a granddaughter." Sarah's next words came sharp as glass. "No, you don't. You lost that right the night you locked your door." He reached out with a trembling hand. "Sarah, please, let me see her just once. Let me tell her I'm sorry." She stepped back. Mary doesn't need your sorrow. She already has a family, Janet, Ruth, and me. We built something real out of what you destroyed." Elijah broke down, tears falling freely. "I destroyed everything," he whispered. "My church, my daughter, my faith, all gone because I cared more about what people thought than what God wanted." Sarah crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "And what do you think God wanted?" she asked. "For me to die on a street because your pride mattered more than my life?" He shook his head, sobbing. No, I was blind. I see it now." She took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "You see it now because it's too late." He looked up, eyes red and hollow. "Tell me one thing," he begged. "Why didn't you tell me what really happened? Why didn't you tell me how you became pregnant?" The room fell silent. For the first time, Sarah's mask cracked. She set the chart down slowly, her fingers trembling. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me," she said softly. "You would have blamed me like you blamed everyone who didn't fit your sermons." Elijah frowned, confused. "Believe what?" Sarah met his eyes. "That I didn't choose it. That I was attacked. Walking home from school that night, a man dragged me into an alley. I never told anyone because I was ashamed, because your sermons taught me to be." The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came. "No," he whispered. "Oh God, no." His breathing quickened. The heart monitor spiked in sharp beeps. "You threw me out to protect your reputation," Sarah continued, tears finally falling. "But what you really did was abandon a victim, your own child, and you called it righteousness." He covered his face with trembling hands, a sound escaping him, part sob, part prayer. "Sarah, I didn't know. She took a step back, voice trembling with the weight of 7 years. "That's the tragedy, Papa. You never asked." The heart monitor beeped faster, his breathing unsteady, panic flickering across his features. Sarah turned away, composing herself. "You'll need rest," she said, voice steady once more. "The doctor will be in soon." As she reached the door, his voice broke behind her. "How can I ever make this right?" She paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh hospital light. "You can't," she said softly. "But I can, by living without your shame." Then she walked out, leaving him alone in the sterile white room, the sound of his own heartbeat loud and uneven in the silence. And as tears fell onto the pages of his Bible, he finally understood that judgment without compassion was not holiness, it was hell. Yet one question still haunted him as the monitor beeped into the night. Would she ever come back? For the next week, the sterile walls of room 314 became Pastor Elijah's entire world. Machines hummed quietly around him, their rhythm the only reminder that his heart still fought to keep going. Every hour a nurse would enter, sometimes it was Sarah, sometimes it wasn't. When it was her, the air thickened with things unsaid. She checked his pulse, adjusted his IV drip, and recorded numbers in silence, her professional calm unshaken. But inside her, fragments of memory cut deep, his voice shouting, the door slamming, the winter air slicing her lungs as she walked away into the night 7 years ago. Pastor Elijah spent most of his time staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the weight of his own repentance. He had built his life on sermons about mercy, yet had never practiced it. He thought about his congregation, how they had once looked at him with reverence, and now with pity. He thought about Sarah's words, "You never asked." That sentence echoed louder than any sermon he had ever given. On the 4th day, when Sarah came in to check his vitals, he spoke again, voice barely a whisper. "I've asked the Lord for forgiveness, but I don't think he's listening anymore." Sarah kept her eyes on the monitor. "He probably is," she said evenly. "But maybe he's waiting for you to forgive yourself first." The words surprised even her. He looked up, eyes glassy. "And you?" he asked softly. "Will you ever forgive me?" She paused, taking a breath. "Forgiveness isn't about giving you peace," she said finally. "It's about letting go of what you took from me. I'm still learning how." He nodded slowly, his lips trembling. "You're stronger than I ever was." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, rain pattered softly against the window, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. The next day, the social worker arrived with transfer papers. Pastor Elijah's medical condition had stabilized enough for discharge to a long-term care facility. Sarah handled the documentation herself, efficient, precise, distant. She explained the details as if speaking to any other patient. "You'll be going to Sunset Manor," she said. "It's one of the better facilities in the city. The staff there will monitor your rehabilitation." He nodded, voice breaking. "And you? Will you visit?" Sarah met his gaze for a long moment. "You'll have good care," she replied. "That's what matters." He closed his eyes, the pain of her distance more cutting than the foreneedle in his arm. "Please," he said hoarsely, "let me see her just once. My granddaughter. I just want to know her face." Sarah's hand froze mid-motion. She inhaled slowly, fighting back the tears rising behind her composure. "Mary doesn't need to meet the man who made me feel unworthy of love," she said quietly. "She has everything she needs, and I'll keep it that way." He wept openly now, shoulders shaking. "Then let me at least give her something," he pleaded. "My Bible. It's all I have left. It's yours, Sarah. For her. Maybe one day she'll read it and understand." Sarah hesitated, then took the worn, leather-bound book from the nightstand. Its pages were thin, corners bent, and inside, she saw something written in the margins, his handwriting from years ago, verses underlined, notes about forgiveness, love, sacrifice. All the things he had preached, but never lived. She closed the book and held it to her chest for a brief second before setting it on the counter. "Maybe," she said softly, "someday." When the ambulance arrived that afternoon, Sarah stood by the door as two paramedics wheeled him out. Pastor Elijah looked back at her, searching her face for any trace of warmth. "You look just like your mother when you're angry," he said, a weak, wistful smile tugging at his lips. Sarah didn't reply, but her eyes flickered one brief flash of something human before the mask returned. As the stretcher rolled down the corridor, he whispered to himself, "God, please let that not be the last time I see her." That night, Sarah drove home in silence, the city lights passing like memories she couldn't touch. When she arrived, Janet and Mary were sitting on the floor, building a tower of wooden blocks. "Mama!" Mary cried, running to her with outstretched arms. Sarah dropped to her knees, hugging her tightly. "You're home early," Mary giggled. "Did you save people today?" Sarah smiled through the heaviness in her chest. "Maybe just one," she whispered. Janet noticed the distant look in her eyes and waited until Mary had gone to bed before speaking. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked gently. "He's been transferred." Sarah nodded. "He begged to see her, to see Mary." Janet set down her teacup. "And what did you say?" "That she already has all the family she needs." Sarah looked toward the hallway where her daughter slept peacefully. "He's dying surrounded by the consequences of his choices. I don't owe him anything." Janet reached across the table and took her hand. "You're right," she said softly. "But sometimes peace doesn't come from what we owe, it comes from what we release." Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes drifted toward the Bible sitting on the counter. She hadn't opened it yet, but she knew she would. Not for him, but for the part of herself that still needed closure. Because even though the past was over, it still whispered at the edges of her heart. And deep down, she sensed that before this story truly ended, there was one more chapter waiting, one final moment that would decide whether forgiveness was something she could give or something she would finally find. The following weeks passed quietly, but peace did not come easily. Sarah went back to her work at City General Hospital, moving through the sterile corridors with her usual grace and discipline. Yet every time she passed the cardiac ward, a flicker of memory returned, the sound of the heart monitor, the look in her father's eyes, the weight of everything he had never said until it was far too late. Some nights, when the hospital lights dimmed and the halls grew still, she thought she could still hear his voice echoing faintly from room 314. "I was wrong." At home, life went on. Janet hummed softly while making breakfast. Mary painted pictures of Mama saving people. The world had found its rhythm again. But inside Sarah, something unresolved still pulsed an ache, not of anger, but of unfinished forgiveness. She hadn't visited Sunset Manor, not once. Yet the image of her father's frail hands clutching his Bible haunted her. Every time she touched the book he had given her, she felt torn between memory and mercy. One evening, while Mary slept, and Janet was reading in her chair, Sarah finally opened the Bible. Between the yellowed pages, she found an old photograph, her mother, smiling, holding a baby Sarah in her arms. The handwriting beneath it was Elijah's, faded but clear: "Train up a child in the way she should go, and when she is old, she will not depart from it." Sarah stared at the words until her vision blurred. For the first time, she realized that her father's cruelty had not erased every part of him. Somewhere inside the man who failed her had once been someone who tried to love. The next morning, she drove to Sunset Manor. The facility sat on a quiet hill surrounded by oak trees, their branches trembling in the winter wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant. A nurse at the reception desk smiled kindly. "Are you here to see Pastor Williams?" Sarah hesitated before nodding. "He's been expecting you," the nurse said. "He asks about you every day." When Sarah entered his room, she was struck by how much smaller he looked. His Bible rested open on the tray table beside him, his fingers too weak to turn the pages. He looked up slowly, eyes clouded with both surprise and disbelief. "Sarah?" he whispered. "You came." She took a seat by his bed but didn't speak at first. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, more like the pause before a long-delayed truth. "I found the picture," she said finally, "of Mom and me." His eyes softened. "Your mother was the best of us," he murmured. "She would have known what to do. She always said love isn't proven by rules, but by grace. I should have listened." Sarah folded her hands in her lap. "You hurt me more than anyone ever could, but I think I finally understand something." He looked at her, waiting. "Forgiving you doesn't mean I excuse what you did," she said. "It means I won't let it define me anymore." Tears slid down his face, fragile and slow. "Then I can go in peace," he whispered. "If you forgive me, even a little, then maybe God will too." Sarah stood and touched his shoulder lightly, the first time she had done so in 7 years. "You already had his forgiveness," she said quietly. "You just didn't believe you deserved it." His lips trembled into a faint smile. "And Mary?" he asked softly. "Does she know about me?" Sarah hesitated. "Not yet, but one day, when she's ready, I'll tell her about her grandfather, the man who made mistakes, and the man who tried to make peace." Pastor Elijah closed his eyes, his breathing slowing. "Thank you," he murmured, "for giving me back a piece of my soul." For a moment, Sarah thought he had drifted into sleep. But as the silence stretched, she realized he wasn't just resting. His chest rose one last time, and then stilled. The monitor beside him gave a single steady tone before fading into quiet. Sarah stood there, unmoving, as the nurse entered the room. "I'm sorry," the nurse said softly. Sarah nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. "It's all right," she whispered. "He's free now." That evening, she returned home to Janet's warm kitchen and Mary's laughter echoing down the hallway. "Mama, look," Mary said, holding up a crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands beneath a bright Sunday. "It's us." Sarah smiled through her tears. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Janet looked at her knowingly. "You went to see him, didn't you?" Sarah nodded. "He's gone now." Janet reached out and squeezed her hand. "Then you did what needed to be done." Later that night, after Mary had fallen asleep, Sarah stood by the window, watching the moon cast its pale light across the quiet street. The ache in her chest felt lighter, not gone, but changed. She thought of her father, not the preacher, not the man who failed her, but the broken human being who had finally found his own redemption. She whispered into the silence, "Rest, Papa, you're forgiven." The wind rustled the trees outside as if carrying her words away into the night. Sarah turned from the window and walked toward Mary's room. Her daughter stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly, "Mama." Sarah brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her gently. "You'll never have to doubt love," she whispered. "Not ever." And in that moment, she understood the truth her father never could, that grace isn't found in judgment, but in the courage to love anyway.